on a very important question, and that is how we're able to sustain the momentum that we've built in the month of Ramadan, how to maintain our spirituality. Because I think all of us can agree that, you know, if the past has been any indication of what is going to happen in the future, it is that, you know, we tend to kind of decline in our spirituality after the month of Ramadan. You know, we're energetic in the month of Ramadan. We're praying on time. We're reciting the Quran, and then after, gradually we start to fall off the cliff. Now, before I address that specific question, which is really a question about the phenomenon of spiritual fluctuations, right? Because we all experience spiritual fluctuations in the sense that, you know, during certain times of the year, during certain months, during certain occasions, we experience that spiritual high, and that's often followed by a crash or a decline. Now, if there's a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam that speaks about this, and believe it or not, brothers and sisters, it's actually an unrealistic expectation to think that you are going to just be on an incline on your spiritual path. The reality is that these fluctuations are actually natural. In fact, even the word qalb comes from a verb which means to change, because it is in the nature of the heart to undergo change, right? And that's why, for example, we have in Sahifa Sajjadiyya, we have, you know, the munajat of Imam Zain al-Abidin. And if you look at the munajat of Imam Zain al-Abidin, they are really supplications that are customized for the different states of the heart, right? You know, munajatul shakirin, the whispered prayers of the grateful. You know, sometimes your heart is filled with gratitude. Munajatul khaifin, the whispered prayers of the fearful. Munajatul muridin, the whispered prayers of the wishers or the seekers. So you find that it's in the nature of the heart to change. And there's a beautiful hadith from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen where he says, "Inna lil qulubi iqbalan wa idbara." Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says that the hearts, our hearts, have moments where they advance towards Allah, and we also there are moments where the heart retreats. It tries to move away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the Imam gives very important advice that most of us don't actually apply. The Imam alayhi salam, he says, فَإِذَا أَقْبَلَتْ فَاحْمِلُوهَا عَلَى النَّوَافِلِ. When you feel that your heart is inclined towards God. And sometimes you have those moments where you feel spiritual, where you're in the mood to worship. So the Imam says, فَإِذَا أَقْبَلَتْ فَاحْمِلُوهَا عَلَى النَّوَافِلِ. When the heart is inclined towards Allah, take advantage. Meaning, recite those supplications, perform those superfluous prayers, do the nawafil. And then the Imam says what? وَإِذَا أَدْبَرَتْ فَاقْتَصِرُوا بِهَا عَلَى الْفَرَائِضِ. But when you feel that your heart is not inclined towards God, if you feel that spiritual heaviness, and this happens to all of us, there are days where you're just not in the mood for worship. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says that on those days when you're having your spiritual lows, just stick to the wajibat. Don't pressure yourself to go beyond that. And this is important, brothers and sisters, because you and I, unfortunately, we have this impression that rain or shine, no matter what, I should always commit myself to doing the nawafil, even if I'm not in the mood for it. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib is teaching us that we have to be delicate with our souls. If you force yourself to do those extra prayers and those extra du'as in moments where you're not in the mood for it, your soul is going to develop an aversion towards worship. So you have to really pay attention to the heart. You have to really gauge your heart. If the heart is yearning for God, it's yearning for worship, take advantage of it. As they say, ride the wave. But if you feel that the heart is in a state of idbar, then don't put pressure on yourself. Just stick to the wajib. And the analogy that I often give is that when you go to the gym, for those, obviously not during the COVID-19 pandemic, but back in the day when we used to go to the gym, there were days, I'm sure we've all experienced this. There are some days where you just feel lethargic, you feel tired, and you don't feel as motivated, and maybe your body's a bit fatigued. The worst thing that you could do is try to lift more weight than you can handle, because if you lift more than you can handle, you'll end up pulling a muscle. So you have to kind of have this awareness of the state of your body. Now, when you're energized, say you had a good breakfast and you're feeling energized, sure, go to the gym and push yourself a little bit. So this is an important principle, and unfortunately, in many of our mosques, we overwhelm our attendees. Many of you might have been to a masjid where you go to the program. The program starts with what? We're going to read Surah Yasin. Okay, then after Surah Yasin, we're going to read Dua Kumail. And then after Dua Kumail, we're going to read Hadith al-Kisa. And then after Hadith al-Kisa, we're going to do, Ziyarat Warith. And then after Ziyarat Warith, and then there's a 45-minute lecture after that. And then we're going to do another dua after that. That puts a lot of burden on people. There are many, and sometimes we do this individually to ourselves. If you want to be able to sustain your spirituality, you have to pay attention to the condition of your heart. If the heart is inclined towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then by all means, take out Mafatih al-Jinan and recite those supplications. Do the ziyarat. But if the heart is retreating, stick to the wajibat. Now, you're never allowed to abandon the obligations. You can't just say that I'm not in the mood, so today I'm just not going to pray Salat al-Fajr. No, the wajibat are crucial. It's kind of like, think about it as the minimum calorie intake. To be healthy, there's a minimum calorie intake for your body. So think of the wajibat as the minimum calorie intake for you to maintain your spirituality. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind when we discuss maintaining our spirituality, being attuned to our souls. When the heart is yearning for Allah, push it to do those recommended acts. When the heart is retreating and you're experiencing that spiritual low, then commit yourself only to the wajibat and don't put pressure on yourself, because you don't want to start to see ibadah as a burden. Okay? Now, one of the most important things to keep in mind when we try to maintain our spirituality is, there's a beautiful conversation between the Prophet ﷺ and Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. And this was after the Prophet delivered his famous month of Ramadan sermon. After the Prophet delivered this sermon, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib approaches the Prophet and he asks him, and many of you are familiar with this exchange. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib asked the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, ma afdalul a'malu fi hadha ash-shahr? What is the best thing to do in this month, in the month of Ramadan? What does the Prophet say? And by the way, the answer that the Prophet, the question that the Imam is asking doesn't only apply to the month of Ramadan. This is the best thing that you can do in the month. If it's the best thing to do in the month of Ramadan, then you can imagine that it's probably the best thing to do in life. ما أفضل الأعمال في هذا الشهر? What is the best thing to do in this month? Listen to what the Prophet says. He says, أفضل الأعمال الورع عن محارم الله. The best thing that you can do is to refrain from committing sin. You know, brothers and sisters, many of us, we don't follow this important spiritual principle. You know, for example, some of us, we backbite. Some of us, we don't observe the hijab. Some of us, we don't pay khums. We commit these sins and we've just accepted these sinful acts as habits. It's a habit. And what do we usually do? We try to compensate for those sins or for the abandonment of our wajibat by doing what? We try to do mustahabbat to make up for it. So for example, imagine there's someone who doesn't even make an effort to wake up for Salatul Fajr. So that means what? That means that they're committing a sin. And that same person, for example, will recite Dua Abu Hamza al-Thumali, they'll recite Dua Kumail, they'll go on ziyarah every year. We have to understand, brothers and sisters, that there is no recommended act that can make up for a wajib that we're missing. You know, Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, اجتناب السيئات أولى من اكتساب الحسنات. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says, avoiding sin has more priority than doing good deeds that are considered extra. So for example, who's better in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Someone who prays Salatul Fajr Qadha every day and prays Salatul Layl and recites Dua Kumail and does all of these ziyarat, or someone who just does the bare minimum wajib but avoids haram? The answer, according to the Ahlul Bayt, is what? If a person just does the wajibat, the bare minimum wajib, and they avoid the muharramat and they do nothing else, they don't recite Dua Kumail, they don't go on ziyarah, they don't do any of those things. They just stick to the wajibat. In the eyes of God, that person is more beloved than the person who takes the obligations lightly and does all of these extra actions. So if we want to maintain our spirituality, first we have to understand what it takes to be spiritual to begin with. You know, sometimes we think spirituality is this exotic branch of Islam and there's a secret that we have to figure out, as if it's some type of code that we have to decipher. You know, sometimes we think that, you know, I just need that. There's a secret dua that I need to get my hands on. And if I recite that dua, then I'll become a spiritual person. Spirituality, brothers and sisters, it begins with fulfilling the wajibat and avoiding the muharramat. You know, sometimes we make it more complicated than it needs to be. And you will never taste true spirituality as long as you're committing sins. You know, it's comparable to someone who eats junk food and goes to the gym and works out. Someone like that, you know, as they say, 80% of fitness is about what you eat. Right? You can spend hours and hours in the gym, but if you're not eating healthy food, then you're not going to be able to develop muscle. You're not going to be able to be healthy. You're not going to look like a healthy person. Similarly, if we are committing haram, even if we recite Dua Kumail and we recite all of these supplications, but we're not making any effort to avoid the muharramat, it's not going to have an impact. You know, there's a beautiful story about Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. So Imam al-Baqir, the father, and Imam al-Sadiq, the son, they're in Mecca and they're performing tawaf. Imam al-Sadiq was young and Imam al-Sadiq was performing a mustahab tawaf, and he was sweating and there was a lot of crowds and he was exerting himself in the performance of a recommended act. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he saw his son, Imam al-Sadiq, sweating. He's putting so much effort into fulfilling this recommended act. And Imam al-Baqir, he puts his hand on his shoulder and he says, "Oh my son, you don't need to go above and beyond. You don't need to put that much more effort if you have taqwa." If you have taqwa. Meaning, if you avoid the muharramat and you do your wajibat, it doesn't take very much beyond that to please Allah.